Well, new developments indicate that the pink tide is returning to Latin America, and we're joined now by Director for the Andes, Gimena Sanchez, who's here to discuss this trend. Gimena, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Of course, so let's just dive right in. Tell us what we know about the return of the pink tide to Latin America and any recent developments that really indicate this could be a return of the pink tide.
Well, in Colombia this Sunday, we're going to have the first presidential elections in history where you could potentially have a left-wing candidate actually win. For some 200 years, Colombia has mostly been governed by conservative and right-wing presidents. But the pandemic, the insecurity, a large civic strike that took over most of the country a year ago, as well as a lot of discontent with traditional politics, has placed a left-wing populist president candidate, Gustavo Petro, and a vice presidential candidate who is Afro-Colombian, Francia Marquez, the first time in history that you have vice presidential candidates of Afro-descendancy in that country, with the potential of actually winning in the first round this Sunday.
And Gimena, to give people a sense of how big a shift this could be, can you talk a little bit about the backgrounds of both Petro and Francia Marquez? Because these are not the typical types of politicians that have been winning elections in Colombia.
Not at all. Most of the winners of the elections in all these years have been from the political parties that have ruled the country for years. They have come from the established families. They have been either technocrats or the sons or relatives of prior candidates for presidency and so forth. So Gustavo Petro is the former mayor of Bogota, a very progressive mayor. He is a former member of the M19 guerrilla that demobilized and ushered in the 1991 Constitutional Assembly that led to a new political constitution. And the vice presidential candidate, Francia Marquez, is Afro-descendant. She is a single mother. She's never held political office. She won the Goldman Environmental Prize, and she has her claim to fame really has been that she had her community stand up to illegal gold mining interests in a region of Colombia that is one of the most hotly disputed at this time by illegal armed groups. So neither of them are your typical political figures in the national stage in Colombia.
So yeah, on that point, what do we know, or how are there differences in these politicians and these candidates' attitude or posture towards the United States? Is there a sort of general consensus that they share on the United States, the role of the United States, and perhaps problems in their own country? How do they approach that question of the U.S.?
Well, the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia has been a very bipartisan relationship, both here and there. So in general, I think that they both want to have a good relationship with the United States. However, some of their points of views are not your typical points of views. One of them being that Gustavo Petro wants to open up relationships with the cousin country of Venezuela, something that is not particularly favored by sectors in the political establishment here in the United States. Also that they want to take a look at the free trade agreements that Colombia has signed globally, especially the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. They want to change the focus of the economy, which at this time is very heavily reliant on extractive industries, and look for more environmentally sustainable type projects, maybe industrialization. This has also produced some concern among investors and other sectors in the United States. And I think lastly, rather than the main focus of the U.S.-Colombia relationship being security policy and drug policy, I think we're going to see that the main focus is going to be more on advancing the peace process with the FARC, opening up dialogue with the secondary guerrilla group, the ELN, and more what would be like social projects to try to address poverty and inequality in Colombia, which has gotten to new highs after the pandemic.
Yeah, and you also had the left winning recently in Chile with Gabriel Boric declaring an end to neoliberalism. You've had victories elsewhere. It looks like Brazil is potentially trending in a leftward direction. Why do you think it is that Mexico? Why do you think it is that Central and South America are responding in this way to the current global conditions, compared to other countries that seem to be, kind of moving in a rightward authoritarian direction?
Well, I think that this has to do really with the pandemic. I mean, already the region was very unequal. The distribution of resources really didn't hit a lot of the rural and poor population, or the more ethnic populations like Afro descendants and indigenous communities. And I think that the pandemic and the bad handling of the funds to alleviate the pandemic and rampant corruption led to a major backlash against the whole economic model that's really been the central model pushed in the past 60 years in the region, which has been very neoliberal. And so people are trying to look for a change, something that can help them alleviate poverty, help them with hunger, which has grown in many areas, in particular Colombia. And in the case of Colombia particularly, the hardline security policies are really aligned more with the right. And unfortunately, those policies haven't been giving the result that they should. So Colombia has had multiple massacres in recent years. Killings of social leaders are rampant, and we've had mass displacement, the highest level of insecurity and humanitarian crisis in the past 5 years. And so I think that people are looking for a difference. And so they see that why not? Why not try something completely different? And that's why they're rallying behind, and I mean, not the entire country, but the poorer sectors, the sectors most affected by violence, behind a left-wing candidate.
Yeah, and of course, then there's the other side of that coin. When people are thinking, why not try something else? It can give way to the rise of, actual fascist wings of the right and different factions in that sense. What is the contrast with some of these pink tide candidates? What are we seeing from the right in some of these countries in response to the conditions you just discussed, the pandemic conditions? How is the right responding to those same factors?
Well, interestingly, you have a situation that is very interesting in Colombia. You have kind of a out of left field candidate that is actually polling very high and is the major opposition to the right-wing candidate in Colombia. His name is Rodolfo Hernandez. And he basically has no real ties to the political establishment. He is popular for coming up with, very colorful tweets and just saying what he thinks at the moment. He has a generalized policy that is anti-corruption, but no real agenda. So we're seeing that that has been an interesting response. In the case of Brazil, actually, the right wing has been gaining a lot of ground. And there you're seeing that that's mostly because of that same thing, that speaking directly to the emotions and the fears of many people in the country, no more political correctness in any of the statements, and also programs to try to alleviate poverty. In the case of Brazil, that is gaining ground, and we're seeing that the right is very possibly going to win again. In the case of Colombia, it hasn't worked as well, although the same effort was tried, and that's basically because of the corruption. The other response that we're seeing in Colombia from the right is a lot of fear-mongering about Venezuela, about, if Petro wins, we're going to have a repeat of Venezuela and Colombia. But if you look at the history of the left in Colombia, that's very unlikely to be the case.
Right. Not to put you too much on the spot, but any sense of how this is going to go this weekend?
Well, after working in Colombia for 20 years, anything could happen. But the polls are really pointing towards Gustavo Petro winning on the first round. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think it's going to be very close between him. The wild card is going to be who will be the second one, because Rodolfo Hernandez has been polling so well, and there is a whole sector of the population that's undecided. And historically in Colombia, that population tends to go more with the establishment. It could also be Fico, which is the right-wing candidate. In any event, I think it will go to a second round. My biggest fear, given what just happened in March 13th with the congressional elections, where there were lots of calls for fraud and resignation of the registrar of the National Electoral Council, is that one of the sides may not accept the results. And in a context where you just had two major armed strikes in the country, such a high level of violence, so many death threats issued against the candidates, and even the revelation of assassination plots, that this could turn into a violent situation. And so our call is for the U.S. to really say, whatever happens, keep calm and let the process run itself out.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a potential for the right to run the same playbook they ran in 2019 in Bolivia, which was leading up to the elections, warn that there was going to be all of this fraud, and then on the night of the election say, oh, look, there was all this fraud, have people pour into the streets. They basically force Evo out of power, and then they held on to power for a year until Evo's party was able to come back. So we certainly could see another version of that. That's an interesting point to look out for it. But Gimena, we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will have more Rising right after this.